I followed with some amusement the news this last week as the what used to be the Powerball, that's how I call it, mega whatever it is, jackpot going all around the country, had reached a near record level of $1.2 billion. And you may not know heading into the weekend that this time there was a winning ticket sold somewhere in Illinois. And no, I did not buy a ticket. I bought a lottery ticket in forever, as you're about to hear. But the reason why I smiled when it came to my memory, I remembered back in the 1980s when Michael and I were together, and I discovered that the one passion he had was the lottery if the jackpot was over 200 million. Now, the Powerball back then was only in 5 states. We were in Indianapolis, and Illinois always had the Powerball sales. So once the jackpot was over 200 million, we would get in the car and drive the 90 miles to Danville, Illinois, a town I knew very well. I was a prosecutor for the Justice Department. One of our prisons was in that town. There's no other reason to go there, but it was right over the border. So we would go over there and go to the liquor store where there's bars covering everything. Of course, now we have that in the Highlands, but back then we didn't. So just like this, what a creepy place to buy a lottery ticket, and you had to stand in line for quite a while because other people were doing the very same thing. We would get back and I would forget about it. And the drawing back then was like on a Tuesday or something. This was on the weekend. And so I finally asked Michael, I said, well, did we win? Like the royal we, like I really haven't done anything, invested anything in this particular ticket. He says, oh, I like to wait and just think about what I will do with all of that money. And at some point, he decided that he checked the money, he doesn't win, and he simply moved on. All that made me smile. That whole idea of the lottery, the sudden explosion of wealth that someone or a consortium has purchased, $1.2 billion. Well, I guess sooner than we think we'll hear about who won that lucky jackpot. I told you that I'd given up the lottery, but didn't tell you why. When I was pastor at Ascension, our maintenance manager, Jim, ran what was called our lottery pool. He is Mr. Lottery with a capital L. He does the little 3-numbered ball, the 4-numbered draws, and he loves that stuff. Keeps copious records for his taxes. But he also managed the Mega Millions, or Powerball is what we called it back then, pool. So you would subscribe to the pool. All you had to know was when he came to you and won $20, you had to give your next investment to him. And he kept copious records. That's a corporate law in law school, and his division of how each person had their right share and what they began to win was second to none. I've never quite seen any setup like that. So I just waited till he came around. We were celebrating confirmation really for the first time with Archbishop Kurtz. He was in the sacristy when Jim came in there and asked for my $20 for the lottery pool. And I pulled out the wallet and gave him the $20, and Archbishop looked a little strange. He said, well, what's the lottery pool? So I explained to him what that was, and that we would divide up the winnings. And then he surprised me with his next question. He said, Gary, if you were to win, would you leave us? Which startled me, because I hadn't thought about that at all. And then, as you know, I know my way around the sarcastic comment. I looked back at him and suddenly smiled and said, oh no, Archbishop, I wouldn't leave. I would remain behind to be an enormous thorn in your side. Well, as you know, we never won the lottery. Maybe I was a thorn in his side anyway, but not as big as I would have been if I'd been wealthy. But that whole set of stories simply reminds me the lure of money, this huge amounts that sometimes can be available, and we know how that can be very beguiling to our imagination. Jesus knows this too, and so tonight we get the parable of the rich fool. Now, I'm sure you were listening carefully. Prior to the parable, a little episode takes place. 2 siblings are fighting over inheritance. When have I heard that one before? And they finally go to Jesus and they want him to arbitrate the dispute. Tell my brother to give me a share of the inheritance. Anyone that knows anything about those types of disputes, the last thing you want to do is get involved in one of them. And Jesus wisely says, who appointed me judge or arbitrator? And then he reminded them that there's more to life than simply possessions. From that episode comes our parable of the rich fool. Now remember, in the parable, it's fiction. Jesus is telling a story to make a point. So he tells the story of a grain farmer who has a bountiful harvest, more than he could possibly imagine. More grain than even his bins were able to store. And his response to this sudden, what we call embarrassment of riches, was to suddenly contemplate, I'm going to tear down my existing barns and build even larger ones, because with this embarrassment of riches, I'm going to be able to retire early, to eat, drink, and be merry for the rest of my life. And then Jesus pulls the kicker in the story. He says, you fool, tonight your life will be demanded of you, and to whom will your riches go? It's a morality tale about the choices that we make and sometimes what their consequences are. I found a better, not better, I've never improved on one of the Lord's parables. What did I mean by that? I just found a more recent example that parallels this. From a novel that I read in a class called The American Novel when I was in college. It made quite an impression on me. It's written in the 1890s, the very end of the 19th century. It's a classic of what we call naturalism, meaning the novelist is trying to point out all of the social ills in the world and dealing with, making us deal with those and feel feelings about them. The novel is called The Octopus by Norris, and it's a story about how California at the end of the 19th century became a place where many people went to grow grain and to hopefully make a good living for themselves. But at the same time, the railroads had come out. They're the octopus in the title. They're tentacles, as we're thought about, with all those tracks. And of course, the railroads are owned by rich people, and they began to cut corners and raise rates and tariffs and charge fees to the landowners. The novel is about how all of these characters growing grain just simply to eke out an existence, each ultimately become bankrupted, each have their farms taken away from them. Most of them fall into starvation and die. One of the women sells herself into prostitution and dies. That's a real happy novel, right? But it's really to be taught about the carnage that has come when the evil railroad comes in and completely squeezes out all the profit. The villain in The Octopus is a man called S. You only see the initial once or twice. S. We never get a first name. Behrman. In fact, when he's normally being mentioned, Behrman is the only thing that you hear. Behrman is a railroad baron. He's also a banker. He's also an attorney. And throughout the course of the novel, he cheats. He connives. He steals. He does all the different sorts of things a person can do in order to increase his wealth. I'm telling you the story because here's how it parallels our parable that we hear this evening. In the climax of the novel, after literally everybody else is dead, there's at least one good person that survives, but I think only one. In the climax of the novel, Behrman has got this enormous grain harvest, and his intention now is to take this embarrassment of riches, this enormous harvest, and it's going to be sold to India, where he's going to make even more money. The amount of grain is simply staggering that he has done. He has reached the pinnacle of his success. Even though he's lied and cheated and stolen his way to this, the victory is his. He can't wait to see it. In the novel's climax, the grain is being put into the upper hull of a ship where it's going to go across the sea, and Behrman's going to make more money than he'd ever seen before. He wanted to see his own wealth, so he goes into the hull of the ship to observe the grain being dumped into this. I'm not giving this justice. The hull of a ship is enormous. We're speaking about an enormous amount of grain that's being dropped in all the time. He looks at it, talks about breathing in the fine particles, smelling the grain, seeing the wealth just simply coming down. And then he trips, and then he falls into the pit of grain. It's rather delicious. I read them again before Mass tonight. For a couple of pages, he slowly sinks and drowns until he's completely covered up with grain, deader than a doorknob. What a rich fool. In both cases, the rich fool of Jesus' parable and the rich fool in Norris's novel, both of them choose, when the opportunity presents itself, selfishness. See, the farmer thinks only of himself. I have this embarrassment of riches. I'm going to give myself a prosperous life. From the tale, you can't even tell if anyone else is going to eat, drink, rest, or be merry with him. And Behrman is interested in no one's wealth but his own wealth. And so in both cases, you see where the choice of selfishness ultimately leads to tragic conclusions, because the selfishness only works with temporal goods, and it does not work with eternal goods. Which brings us to us. Tonight, in the Eucharist, we're once again presented in a different way with an embarrassment of riches. You know, I looked up the phrase. It comes from the late 17th century. It's an idiom, the embarrassment of riches. What it means is a sudden, unexpected, drop into your lap, winning a lottery ticket sort of thing, where you suddenly get a huge increased amount of wealth. You didn't really do something to get it, or you were in the right place at the right time. But basically, this isn't the product of your work. It's not the product of anything else. That's why it's an embarrassment. Riches beyond your imagination, and it is yours. And you see, in the Eucharist, the embarrassment of riches comes a very different way. It becomes in the Eucharist, which offers redeeming and sanctifying grace. This weekend we had 2 baptisms at our 11 o'clock Mass, and I mentioned particularly there, but I mention again here, that at baptism, each child is presented that embarrassment of riches. It's embedded right there in the ritual, that you're to bring your baptismal garment unstained into the everlasting life of heaven, a phrase that we visit in the funeral ritual. It also says that you will receive a heavenly inheritance. There's that word, but that inheritance can only come at the end of your natural life, that something greater than what you see here awaits you. You might call heaven the mother of all embarrassment of riches. But this sacrament, I think, we should give a little more thought to it, which is that, first of all, I mentioned the baptism because it's a singular event in the family's life. It's significant to the family members, and the community tries to embrace bringing new life into the community. And we may miss the fact that it's the single most important event in a disciple's life. In the moment that they're baptized, they become publicly named a disciple of Jesus Christ. That's the dignity that comes of that. Dignity that was already there. The moment we're conceived in our mother's womb, it says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. So that dignity's there, but beneath the surface, beneath the radar, unable for us to see. Baptism makes it visible. And that's why you're baptized only once. The grace you receive remains to the day we celebrate your funeral. But that is not how you and I, even me, understand or believe about sacramental grace. Almost every one of us thinks it's like the gasoline tank in our car, diminishing, high price per gallon, needs some rationing, the natural things that we would think about something that's so important. And for most of us, because of suffering, because of difficulty, because of challenges, that life is just simply hard. All of those things make us believe that somehow we're lacking in the grace department. And perhaps we're actually aware that we've made bad choices. Perhaps we're aware that we just can't seem to escape our sinfulness. By the way, no human can escape their sinfulness. We're like bearmen in the grain. We're drowning. We need a Savior. That's the only way that we can actually come out of this. But we imagine that in such a way that there is no grace, and lose sight of the fact that from the very beginning, when we were conceived in our mother's womb and publicly announced when we were baptized, we already received the only riches that we need. First of 2 times that I went to Medjugorje, one of the visionaries, Ivan, gave a talk because the Blessed Mother had given him a vision of heaven and a vision of hell. I should caveat Medjugorje with it's not officially proved yet by the Church. I choose to believe it, you choose to not believe it. It's not something that's yet been sanctioned yet by the Church, but many people have been there, and that is really a pivotal moment in my spiritual development, hearing those talks and being in, but I think that very sacred place. So Ivan described his vision of heaven and his vision of hell, and then when he spoke, there were questions later. Someone said, well, since you've already seen heaven, what do you think? And he said, I'll never forget it, I'm terrified. So I thought, how can you be terrified of heaven? And he answered, I'm terrified that I might choose hell. That seems so silly. You know, when we hear it, it's so obvious, the vision of heaven, the vision of hell that Mary is giving him. But when we put ourselves in the place of the rich fool, it's suddenly not so obvious. And embarrassments of riches come, and the tendency which comes from the evil one to hoard it, to be selfish with it, to not want to share it. Oh, we should always be very careful about that. That it's so easy to choose selfishness. It's so easy to choose temporal goods here today, maybe not tomorrow. That we should not underestimate how spiritually dangerous that is. Well, I don't want to leave you depressed, because here's the reality. When we receive the Eucharist, the embarrassment of riches continues. The proper way to understand Eucharist is it doesn't make you holier. By the way, it does not. That what it does is remind you that when you were created in your mother's womb, you were already holy, and when you were publicly celebrated as a baptized child of the church, that became visible to the others. It's a reminder of the power of baptism, and even more importantly, the power of God's grace. It's the mother of all embarrassment of riches. Each time, so people may wonder, why do we have to come so often? And I've got an answer for that. But first, by telling you the exact opposite of that. Often I'm called to the hospital, again, just recently in the last week, because I'm a volunteer. When someone doesn't have a parish, I'm willing to come in, and they're Catholic, and give them the sacraments, particularly the sacrament of the anointing of the sick. In case after case after case, many of them haven't darkened the door of a church in decades. They can't even think of how to make a confession. They can't possibly remember all of those things, but now they're frightened. They're at the end of their time, and they know they need to call the priest. I've seen it so many times. And in the sacrament, as I explained, we are instantly touched by Jesus. That's the whole gist of the sacrament. Jesus touches. The priest is the instrument. Jesus is the one who's really doing the touching. He's the one who's doing the healing. And his touch instantly purifies and sanctifies. His touch, in an instant, burns away all stain of sin. There's absolutely nothing left. After his touch, all we have to do is believe that his touch has done that. Early on in my priesthood, I was a little nervous about this, but I would just go and anoint anybody. Then I began to think, am I supposed to make them jump through some hoops? Should they sign up for something? Should they say they're going to start going to church? I'm kind of worried about it because I was pretty cavalier with it. And I remember one night at 2 in the morning, walking out of Baptist East Hospital, looking up at the sky, and I said, if I should not be using the keys, don't give them to me. Then I stopped for a moment and I thought, well, if I get struck by a bolt of lightning, I'll have the answer to my question. Well, I'll relieve you the suspense. No bolt of lightning. And I never worried about it after that. It's an embarrassment of riches. You see, this is not a prize that you win at the end of the line. It's really sad for a person to live their life not certain of what awaits them. It's much better to do what I hope you're doing, regularly celebrating the Eucharist, regularly availing yourself of the sacraments, not because you're going to accumulate grace, because you won't, but because you'll become more and more convinced in this crazy, mixed up, insane world that you actually have an embarrassment of riches waiting for you in the life to come. That's why we come back, because you and I need to be reminded. Outside these doors, selfishness is the order of the day, and is the exact opposite of God, who is purely selfless. The sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, nothing could be more selfless. The entirety of his gift to us, which you and I will receive in Holy Communion. I mentioned about the anointing and the touching. I think it bears, I should also mention now that when you and I receive communion this evening, we will similarly be touched. His touch instantly cleanses. His touch instantly purifies. His touch doesn't add to our grace. It reminds us that the grace is beyond our imagination. So for many of us, me included, who struggle with our lives, our difficulties, our suffering, our ups and downs, all of those things, Eucharist is this wonderful reminder that even though we feel poor, even though we feel without all the things we need, even though we wonder what next is going to happen, turns out we're richer than Rockefeller.